I discovered my sister-in-law Sarah had completely redecorated my family's beloved Lake Tahoe vacation home. During an unannounced visit, replacing my late grandfather's handcrafted furniture with modern pieces and painting over the original wood paneling. Standing in the transformed living room where 3 generations of family memories were made, holding the spare key I had given her 6 months ago as a gesture of trust, I realized the woman I considered family had crossed an unforgivable line just weeks before our annual reunion. My name is Booker, and at 28 years old, I thought I understood what family loyalty meant. Working as a software engineer in Sacramento, I had built what I believed was a stable life with my wife Jessica, whom I had married 4 years earlier. The crown jewel of our family legacy was the rustic log cabin at Lake Tahoe that my grandfather Walter had left to me 3 years ago when he passed away from complications related to diabetes. Walter had built that 3-bedroom home himself back in 1972, situating it perfectly on 2 acres of pristine land with private access to the crystal-clear lake waters. Every piece of furniture inside bore the mark of his skilled hands, from the oak dining table he had carved from a tree that fell during a winter storm to the pine bed frames he had assembled using traditional joinery techniques he learned from his own father. The cabin walls showcased decades of family photographs, and the original cedar paneling had developed a warm honey color that seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. For 15 years, our family had maintained a sacred tradition of gathering there every August. My parents would drive up from Fresno, my brother Marcus would fly in from Denver with his wife and 2 kids, and my sister Chloe would make the trip from Portland with her family. Aunts, uncles, and cousins would converge on that magical place for 7 days of swimming, hiking, barbecuing, and reconnecting with the bonds that held us together across the miles and months that separated us throughout the year. The tradition meant everything to us, especially after Walter passed away. Those gatherings kept his memory alive and honored the legacy he had created with his own hands. The cabin represented more than just a vacation home. It symbolized the continuity of our family values and the importance of maintaining connections across generations. 6 months earlier, our family dynamic had shifted when Jessica's younger sister Sarah found herself in the middle of a devastating divorce. Sarah was 32 years old and had been married to a controlling man who had isolated her from friends and family for nearly a decade. When she finally found the courage to leave him, she emerged from that toxic relationship as a single mother to 8-year-old Emma, with limited financial resources and emotional scars that ran deep. Sarah had always been the more fragile of Jessica's 2 sisters, struggling with anxiety and depression since their teenage years. She possessed a delicate beauty that masked an inner vulnerability, and her recent ordeal had left her looking even more ethereal and breakable than usual. Her auburn hair had lost its luster, and dark circles under her green eyes told the story of sleepless nights filled with worry about her future and her daughter's well-being. When Sarah broke down crying during a family dinner, explaining how she felt lost and afraid in her tiny apartment with Emma, my heart went out to both of them. Emma was a sweet child who had been through too much upheaval for someone so young, and Sarah clearly needed time and space to heal from the trauma she had experienced during her marriage. Initially, Jessica hesitated when I suggested giving Sarah a spare key to the cabin. She warned me that her sister had always struggled with boundaries, even as children growing up together. Sarah had a pattern of taking advantage of people's generosity, Jessica explained, and had caused rifts in friendships by overstepping limits that others had set. But I believed strongly that family helps family during times of crisis. The cabin sat empty most of the year anyway, and if Sarah could find peace and healing in that beautiful setting, then sharing our family sanctuary seemed like the right thing to do. The place had enough space for Sarah and Emma to visit whenever they needed refuge from the stress of rebuilding their lives. I still remember the grateful tears that streamed down Sarah's face when I handed her the brass key during our next family gathering. She promised solemnly that she would respect the space and always give us advance notice before visiting. She swore that she understood the cabin's importance to our family traditions and would never do anything to jeopardize the relationships that mattered so much to all of us. Sarah held that key like it was made of pure gold, thanking me repeatedly for trusting her with something so precious. She spoke about how the mountains and lake would provide the perfect environment for Emma to run and play freely, while she worked on healing her own emotional wounds. The gratitude in her voice seemed absolutely genuine, and Jessica softened when she saw how much the gesture meant to her sister. During our conversation that evening, however, Sarah made an observation that should have raised red flags in my mind. She mentioned casually that she had been researching property values in the Lake Tahoe area and was amazed to discover that our cabin was worth far more than she had initially realized. The real estate market around the lake had exploded in recent years, she noted, and properties with private lake access were commanding premium prices that most people could only dream about. At the time, I dismissed her comment as simple curiosity about an area she would be visiting regularly. I had no reason to suspect that Sarah was already formulating plans that went far beyond using our family retreat as an occasional refuge during her time of need. The first sign of trouble came just 3 weeks after I'd given Sarah the key. Jessica and I decided to drive up to the cabin for a long weekend, planning to enjoy some quiet time together and take care of minor maintenance tasks that always needed attention in a property situated in the mountains. We arrived Friday evening, expecting to find the cabin exactly as we had left it during our previous visit. Instead, we discovered Sarah's car parked in our usual spot with no prior notification that she would be there. When we entered through the front door, we found Sarah and Emma settled comfortably in the living room, with their belongings scattered throughout the main floor as if they had been there for several days. Sarah appeared genuinely surprised to see us jumping up from the couch with an expression of shock and embarrassment. She apologized profusely, explaining that she had assumed we would not be visiting during such a busy time of year at work. She had brought Emma up for what she called a healing retreat and had lost track of the days while they enjoyed the peaceful mountain environment. The awkwardness of the situation made everyone uncomfortable, but I tried to handle it gracefully. After all, I had given her permission to use the space, and miscommunication could happen to anyone. We spent the weekend together, and Emma's joy at exploring the natural surroundings helped ease the tension that her mother's presence had created. The second incident occurred just 1 month later, when our elderly neighbors, who lived year-round in the area, called to report suspicious activity at our property. Frank and Dorothy Morrison had been keeping an informal eye on the cabin for years, and they were concerned about seeing unfamiliar people coming and going at odd hours. When I drove up to investigate, I discovered that Sarah had given the spare key to her friend Rachel, allowing a complete stranger to use our family retreat without any consultation or permission. Rachel was there with her boyfriend, and another couple treating our sacred space like a party venue. Empty beer bottles littered the deck, and I found cigarette butts ground into the wooden planks that my grandfather had installed with his own hands. When I confronted Sarah by phone, she became defensive rather than apologetic. She explained that Rachel was going through her own difficult divorce and desperately needed a mental health break in a peaceful setting. Sarah insisted that she had thought I would not mind helping another struggling woman, since I had been so generous in offering support during her own time of crisis. Sarah claimed she had carefully screened Rachel and trusted her completely to treat the property with respect. She pointed out that she could not be at the cabin personally that weekend due to work obligations, but she did not want Rachel to miss the opportunity for healing that the mountain environment could provide. Her reasoning sounded plausible enough, but the evidence of careless behavior troubled me deeply. The beer bottles and cigarette damage showed a complete lack of respect for the property and its meaning to our family. I made it clear that future guests would need my explicit approval, and Sarah agreed to this condition without argument. The third violation occurred just 2 weeks later. when I decided to make an unplanned trip to the cabin to check on some repairs that needed attention. I discovered the guest book that we kept on the coffee table filled with names and comments from people I had never heard of. Entries dating back several weeks showed that numerous strangers had been using our family sanctuary as if it were a public accommodation. Comments in the guest book praised the amazing hospitality and perfect getaway location, with several entries mentioning how much they had enjoyed their rental experience. One couple had even left a detailed review describing their stay as better than any hotel and promising to definitely book again next season. The realization that multiple unknown people had been staying in our cabin without any notification hit me like a physical blow. The guest book entries revealed that Sarah had been allowing access to our property far more frequently than she had ever admitted, turning our family retreat into an informal bed and breakfast operation. When I confronted Sarah about the guest book evidence, she seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset. She claimed that she had only allowed her close friends to use the space when she could not be there personally. And she insisted that she had been responsible about screening everyone who stayed there. Sarah explained that word had spread naturally among her circle of acquaintances about the beautiful mountain cabin, and several people had expressed interest in experiencing the peace and healing that the location could offer. She maintained that everyone who had stayed there was someone she knew well and trusted completely. Her explanations began to strain credibility, especially when she could not provide specific names or relationships for many of the people who had signed our guest book. The pattern of unauthorized access was clearly escalating beyond anything we had agreed upon when I first offered her the key. Jessica initially defended her sister when I shared my concerns about the situation. She argued that Sarah was still dealing with trauma from her divorce and might not be thinking clearly about boundaries and permissions. Jessica suggested that we needed to be patient and understanding while her sister worked through the emotional challenges of rebuilding her life. The tension that Sarah's behavior was creating in my marriage troubled me almost as much as the violations of our property. I did not want to force Jessica to choose between loyalty to her sister and support for her husband, but the situation was clearly moving in an unhealthy direction. To protect our property and establish clear boundaries, I decided to install a security system with cameras that would monitor access to the cabin. I informed Sarah about the new security measures, hoping that knowing about the surveillance would encourage her to communicate more honestly about any future use of the property. Sarah responded to news of the security system with apparent understanding and renewed promises to improve communication. She apologized sincerely for the confusion and misunderstandings that had occurred, and she assured me that she would be much more careful about respecting our family's ownership of the property going forward. For several weeks after installing the cameras, the situation seemed to stabilize. Sarah made no requests to use the cabin, and the security system showed no unauthorized activity. I began to hope that our conversation had successfully reset expectations and that we could move forward with a healthier arrangement. That hope was completely shattered when I reviewed the security footage from the previous month and discovered that Sarah had been advertising our family cabin on a vacation rental website. The cameras had captured her conducting a virtual tour for the rental listing describing the property as Sarah's Mountain Retreat and offering overnight accommodations for $50 per night. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd experienced before. Sarah had not only violated our trust and property rights, but she had been profiting financially from our family's generosity while maintaining a facade of grateful appreciation for our support during her difficult time. Armed with screenshots of Sarah's vacation rental advertisements, I drove directly to her apartment to confront her about this latest deception. The listing showed professional quality photos of our cabin's interior, complete with detailed descriptions of amenities and local attractions. Sarah had marketed the property as her own personal retreat available for booking by strangers who had no connection to our family whatsoever. When I knocked on her apartment door, Sarah answered with Emma beside her, both of them appearing relaxed and happy. The contrast between their carefree demeanor and my own anger at discovering her betrayal made the confrontation even more difficult to navigate. I did not want to upset Emma, but I needed answers about what Sarah had been doing behind our backs. I showed Sarah the printed screenshots of her rental listings, watching her face change from confusion to recognition to shame as she realized that her secret operation had been exposed. The evidence was undeniable, with timestamps showing that she had been actively renting our property to strangers for weeks while lying to my face about respecting our boundaries. Sarah broke down crying, immediately falling onto her couch, as if the weight of her deception had finally become too much to bear. Between sobs, she admitted that she had been desperate for additional income and had seen the cabin rental as a temporary solution to her financial problems. She claimed that she had planned to tell me about the arrangement eventually, but had been afraid of my reaction. Through her tears, Sarah revealed that Emma had been injured in a playground accident several weeks earlier, requiring expensive medical treatment that her limited insurance did not fully cover. She produced what appeared to be medical bills and treatment records showing thousands of dollars in costs for emergency room visits, specialist consultations, and ongoing physical therapy sessions. The documents looked official and detailed, complete, with letterheads from respected medical facilities in the area. Sarah explained that Emma's injury had been more serious than initially diagnosed, requiring specialized care that was draining her savings and forcing her to consider desperate measures to pay for continued treatment. My anger began to mix with guilt as I looked at Emma, who seemed perfectly healthy and active despite her mother's claims about ongoing medical needs. Sarah noticed my softening expression and pressed her advantage, describing sleepless nights, worrying about how to afford the care that Emma required for full recovery. The emotional manipulation was effective enough that I found myself agreeing to let Sarah keep the money she had already earned from renting our cabin on the condition that she stop immediately and never advertise the property again. Sarah agreed tearfully to these terms, expressing gratitude for my understanding and promising that she would find other ways to address her financial challenges. Sarah showed me additional fabricated medical documents that supported her story about Emma's supposed ongoing treatment needs. The paperwork looked legitimate enough to convince someone who was not looking for signs of deception, complete with doctor signatures and official medical terminology that described a complex recovery process. For 2 weeks after our confrontation, I heard nothing from Sarah about the cabin or any financial difficulties. I began to believe that we had successfully resolved the situation and that she was genuinely working to rebuild her life through honest means rather than exploiting our family's generosity. That belief was completely destroyed when I received an unexpected phone call from a property management company called Mountain Vista Property Management. The caller was a man named Craig Hudson, who wanted to discuss expanding their partnership with Sarah for what he called premium bookings at our Lake Tahoe property. Craig explained that Sarah had approached his company several months earlier, claiming to represent the property owner and seeking professional management services for what she described as a high-end vacation rental. According to Craig, Sarah had been working with their company to position our cabin as an exclusive mountain retreat, complete with premium pricing and luxury marketing materials. The conversation with Craig revealed the true scope of Sarah's deception. She had not simply been renting out our cabin occasionally to friends and acquaintances, but had been operating a sophisticated rental business using our property as her primary asset. Craig's company had been handling bookings, marketing, and even guest services for what they believed was a legitimate rental property under Sarah's management. Craig showed me financial records indicating that Sarah had collected over $3,000 in rental fees during the previous 2 months alone. The income was far more substantial than the occasional $50 nights that I had discovered through her original advertisements. Sarah had been charging premium rates for our property and keeping all of the profits while representing herself as the authorized property manager. The most shocking revelation came when Craig explained that Sarah had been negotiating to sign a 6-month exclusive rental agreement on my behalf. She had presented herself as my authorized representative, complete with forged documents that would give her legal management rights to the property during peak rental seasons. According to Craig, the exclusive agreement would prevent me from using my own property during the most valuable rental periods, essentially giving Sarah complete control over our family cabin for half of each year. The contract would have legally bound me to honor bookings that Sarah made, even if those bookings conflicted with our family's traditional August reunion. Craig produced copies of the documents that Sarah had submitted to his company, including what appeared to be a power of attorney giving her authority to make rental decisions for our property. The forgery was sophisticated enough to fool a property management professional, complete with notary seals and legal language that would have made the arrangement enforceable in court. The realization that Sarah had been planning to gain legal control over our family's most precious asset sent shockwaves through my understanding of her character and intentions. This was not simply a desperate woman making poor decisions during a crisis, but someone who had been systematically planning to exploit our trust and generosity for substantial financial gain. The evidence from Craig's company painted a picture of calculated deception that went far beyond anything I had imagined possible from someone I considered family. Sarah had been building an entire business operation using our property as the foundation while maintaining the pretense of being a grateful recipient of our support during her time of need. I drove home from my meeting with Craig Hudson, feeling sick to my stomach about the extent of Sarah's betrayal. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, showing months of systematic deception that had turned our family sanctuary into Sarah's personal profit center. I expected Jessica to be as outraged as I was when I presented her with the financial records and forged documents that Craig had provided. Instead, Jessica's initial shock quickly gave way to defensive anger, directed at me rather than at her sister. She accused me of entrapping Sarah with surveillance cameras and questioned why I had been investigating her sister's activities so thoroughly instead of simply trusting her explanations and apologies. Jessica argued that Sarah was clearly desperate and making poor decisions because of the trauma she had experienced during her divorce. She suggested that I was being unreasonably harsh towards someone who was already struggling with financial and emotional challenges that would drive anyone to make questionable choices. The conversation escalated into our first serious argument since Sarah had received the cabin key. Jessica seemed to believe that family loyalty required overlooking Sarah's deception and finding ways to help her, rather than confronting her about the damage she had caused to our trust and property rights. To resolve the growing tension between us, I suggested that we arrange a family dinner, where all 4 adults could discuss the situation openly and work toward a solution that addressed everyone's needs. Jessica agreed to this approach, and we arranged to meet at Sarah's apartment the following evening with Emma present so that we could maintain a calm and constructive atmosphere. The dinner started awkwardly, with Sarah appearing nervous and defensive, while Jessica tried to mediate between her sister and her husband. I presented the evidence from Craig's company as objectively as possible, focusing on the facts, rather than making accusations about Sarah's character or motivations. Sarah immediately began manipulating the conversation in ways that I had not anticipated. Rather than denying the evidence or offering explanations, she shifted the focus to her desperation as a single mother trying to provide for her daughter. She portrayed herself as someone who had been forced into deception by circumstances beyond her control. Emma had clearly been coached for this conversation because she tearfully asked me why I wanted to take away the only safe place that she and her mother had found since escaping from her father's abuse. The 8-year-old's words cut through my anger and forced me to confront the human cost of the situation, even though I suspected that Sarah was using her daughter's emotions to manipulate the adults in the room. Sarah then produced what appeared to be eviction notices from her landlord, claiming that she was being forced to leave her current apartment due to financial difficulties. She argued that the income from renting our cabin was her only hope for maintaining stable housing for herself and Emma during their ongoing crisis. The eviction documents looked official and urgent, with deadlines that would force Sarah and Emma into homelessness within weeks if she could not find alternative housing or additional income. Sarah claimed that she had been too embarrassed to ask for direct financial help, so she had tried to solve her problems independently through the rental business. I offered several alternative forms of assistance that would address Sarah's legitimate needs without requiring continued access to our family property. I suggested covering Emma's actual medical expenses, helping Sarah find stable employment, providing temporary financial support while she got back on her feet, or even helping with rent payments to prevent eviction. Sarah rejected every offer I made, insisting that she needed ongoing access to the cabin to maintain the rental business that had become essential to her survival. She argued that taking away her ability to rent the property would destroy the income source that kept her and Emma from becoming homeless. The conversation revealed that Sarah had no intention of giving up control over our cabin or acknowledging that her behavior had violated our trust and property rights. She had convinced herself that her financial needs justified any deception necessary to maintain access to the rental income that our property provided. Jessica's parents, who had initially stayed neutral when they heard about the conflict, began siding with Sarah after she shared her manipulated version of events with them. They called Jessica to express concern that I was being unreasonably harsh towards Sarah during her time of greatest need. The family pressure intensified when Jessica's aunt and uncle also weighed in on Sarah's behalf, arguing that family members should support each other unconditionally during crises, rather than focusing on property rights and financial details that seemed petty compared to Sarah's struggle for survival. I found myself increasingly isolated as more family members accepted Sarah's portrayal of events without questioning her motivations or examining the evidence of her systematic deception. The woman who had forged legal documents to steal control of our property was being treated as a victim who deserved sympathy and support. The most devastating blow came when Jessica pulled me aside privately after the dinner and delivered an ultimatum that shattered my faith in our marriage. She told me that if I did not allow Sarah to continue using the cabin for her rental business, she would leave me and file for divorce. Jessica claimed that my unwillingness to help her sister during a crisis had revealed my true character, showing that I was the kind of person who would abandon family members when they needed support the most. She said she could not stay married to someone so heartless that he would prioritize property rights over helping a desperate single mother and her vulnerable child. The ultimatum forced me to choose between protecting our family's legacy and preserving my marriage to the woman I loved. Jessica had been completely convinced by her sister's manipulation, and no amount of evidence about Sarah's deception seemed capable of changing her mind about where family loyalty should lead us. I realized that Sarah had succeeded in driving a wedge between Jessica and me that might prove impossible to repair. The trust that had been the foundation of our marriage was cracking under the pressure of conflicting loyalties that Sarah had deliberately created through her calculated deception and emotional manipulation. 2 weeks before our family's traditional August reunion, I received a phone call from Sarah that revealed the true extent of her sense of entitlement to our property. She was not calling to apologize for her deception or to negotiate a resolution to our conflict. Instead, she was demanding that I cancel our 15-year family tradition because she had already accepted deposits from multiple paying customers for that same week. Sarah explained that she had marketed the cabin aggressively for the peak summer season and had booked several high-paying families who were specifically attracted to the lakefront location during the most desirable time of year. She claimed that these bookings represented thousands of dollars in revenue that she could not afford to lose by refunding deposits to disappointed customers. Her tone during the phone call was not apologetic or request-oriented, but commanding and expectant. Sarah seemed to genuinely believe that her rental business took priority over our family's long-standing tradition and that I should accommodate her financial needs by moving our reunion to a different location or time. Sarah argued that my family could meet anywhere because we were not dependent on the rental income for survival, while her paying customers had specifically chosen our lakefront property for their vacation plans. She presented her position as if it were obviously reasonable, and my resistance was selfishly unreasonable. I explained to Sarah that the August reunion was not simply a casual gathering that could be easily rescheduled or relocated. The tradition represented 15 years of family bonding, and the timing had been carefully chosen to accommodate everyone's work schedules, school calendars, and other commitments that made the specific week essential for maximum participation. More importantly, I emphasized that the reunion carried deep emotional significance for our aging family members, particularly my grandparents, who viewed the annual gathering as the highlight of their year, and a crucial opportunity to maintain connections with children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren scattered across multiple states. Sarah dismissed these concerns entirely, focusing only on the financial impact of canceling her rental bookings. She had apparently convinced herself that the emotional needs of our family members were less important than her business obligations to paying customers who had no connection to our family history or traditions. When I refused to cancel the reunion, Sarah escalated her tactics by threatening to call the police and file harassment charges against me. She claimed that my attempts to reclaim control of our own property constituted harassment of a vulnerable single mother who was simply trying to provide for her child. Sarah had prepared for this escalation by creating a collection of text messages and emails that could be taken out of context to support her harassment claims. She had saved communications where I had offered financial assistance and help finding employment, twisting them to suggest that I had been manipulating her and Emma through false promises and conditional support. The manipulation was sophisticated enough that someone unfamiliar with the full context might interpret my genuine offers of help as evidence of controlling or predatory behavior toward a struggling woman and her child. Sarah had weaponized my attempts to be supportive and generous, turning them into potential legal ammunition against me. Sarah revealed that she had consulted with an attorney named Marcus Webb, who specialized in tenant rights, and had advised her that 6 months of consistent use of our property might establish some form of legal residency or squatter's rights. According to Webb, Sarah could argue that she had been living at the cabin regularly enough to claim tenant protections under state law. Marcus Webb contacted me directly within hours of Sarah's phone call, presenting a legal argument that was both aggressive and surprisingly sophisticated. He claimed that Sarah's regular use of the property, combined with her investment of time and money in maintaining and marketing the space, had created a legal relationship that required formal eviction proceedings rather than simple removal. Webb threatened to file a civil lawsuit for emotional distress, arguing that my sudden hostility towards Sarah had traumatized both her and Emma by disrupting their sense of security and stability during an already difficult period in their lives. He claimed that my actions had interfered with Sarah's ability to provide stable housing and income for her daughter. The attorney's letter demanded that I either formalize a rental agreement with Sarah on terms favorable to her business, or begin formal eviction proceedings that would take months to complete and would likely result in significant legal costs for both parties. Webb clearly intended to make fighting Sarah more expensive and time-consuming than simply accepting her demands. I was still reeling from Webb's legal threats when Sarah appeared at my front door with Emma and several suitcases announcing that they were moving into my house temporarily while the legal situation was resolved. She had convinced Jessica to support this arrangement by claiming that I had threatened to have Emma taken away by Child Protective Services. The accusation about child services was completely fabricated, but Sarah had presented it to Jessica as evidence that I had become dangerously hostile toward Emma and might take extreme actions to force Sarah out of the cabin. Jessica, already convinced that I was being unreasonable, accepted this latest manipulation without questioning its accuracy. Sarah and Emma moved into my master bedroom while I was relocated to our guest room, creating a surreal situation where the person who had been systematically defrauding me was now living in my own home, with my wife's full support. Sarah acted as if this arrangement was perfectly reasonable and temporary, while I felt like a stranger in my own house. The invasion of my personal space represented the culmination of Sarah's manipulation campaign. She had successfully turned my wife against me, threatened me with legal action, and now physically displaced me from my own bedroom, while presenting herself as the victim in need of protection and support. Emma seemed confused by the tension between the adults, but Sarah had clearly prepared her daughter to view me as the source of their problems, rather than as someone who had been trying to help them during their crisis. The 8-year-old's presence in my house served as emotional leverage that made it impossible for me to confront Sarah directly about her behavior. I realized that Sarah had been planning this escalation for weeks, possibly months, as part of a comprehensive strategy to gain complete control over both our cabin and our household. Her legal threats and claims of victimhood were not desperate reactions to being caught in deception, but calculated moves in a larger game that I was only beginning to understand. The situation had evolved from a simple case of boundary violations into something much more serious and potentially dangerous. Sarah was not simply taking advantage of our generosity, but actively working to destroy my marriage and gain legal control over our most valuable assets through fraud and manipulation. Living in my own guest room while Sarah occupied my master bedroom forced me to confront the reality that I needed professional help to address the escalating situation. I began documenting every interaction and conversation with Sarah, creating a detailed record that might prove essential for legal protection if the situation continued to deteriorate. My documentation efforts were interrupted by an unexpected phone call from Frank Morrison, our 70-year-old neighbor who lived year-round near our Lake Tahoe cabin. Frank was a retired police detective who had moved to the mountains after 30 years of law enforcement work in Oakland, and he had been keeping an informal eye on our property for years, as a favor to my grandfather. Frank's call carried a sense of urgency that immediately captured my attention. He explained that he had been monitoring suspicious activity around our cabin and had discovered patterns of behavior that concerned his law enforcement instincts. Frank had observed Sarah bringing multiple different men to the property for overnight stays, often accompanied by loud parties that disturbed the peaceful mountain community. The security footage that I reviewed with Frank's assistance revealed activities that went far beyond simple vacation rentals. Sarah had been hosting what appeared to be business meetings at our cabin, allowing guests to use my grandfather's handcrafted furniture and personal belongings as if they were part of a commercial hospitality operation. Frank showed me photographs he had taken of damage to the property that I had not discovered during my own visits: cigarette burns on the deck railings, wine stains on the carpeting, and scratches on Walter's carefully maintained wooden furniture told a story of careless treatment that violated everything our family held sacred about the cabin's legacy. More disturbing were Frank's observations about the types of people Sarah had been bringing to the property. He had noticed individuals arriving at odd hours, staying for brief periods, and engaging in activities that suggested business transactions rather than recreational visits. Frank's law enforcement experience made him suspicious that Sarah might be involved in activities beyond simple vacation rentals. Frank introduced me to his friend Patricia Coleman, an attorney who specialized in property fraud cases and had extensive experience dealing with squatters' rights claims and rental scams. Patricia agreed to review the evidence I had collected about Sarah's activities and provide professional legal advice about protecting our property rights. Patricia's initial assessment of the situation was both reassuring and alarming. She confirmed that Marcus Webb's threats about squatters' rights were largely groundless, since Sarah had never established actual residency at the cabin, and her rental activities actually undermined any claim to tenant protections under state law. However, Patricia was deeply concerned about the sophistication of Sarah's operation and the potential for more serious legal violations than simple property misuse. She recommended conducting a thorough background investigation to determine whether Sarah had engaged in similar schemes in other locations or with other victims. The background investigation that Patricia arranged revealed information that completely changed my understanding of who Sarah really was and what she had been planning from the beginning of our relationship. Sarah was not simply a desperate woman making poor decisions during a crisis, but someone with a documented pattern of targeting families through personal relationships and exploiting their generosity for financial gain. Patricia discovered that Sarah had pulled similar schemes in 2 other states over the previous 5 years, using romantic relationships and family connections to gain access to valuable properties belonging to trusting victims. In each case, Sarah had presented herself as someone in crisis who needed temporary help, then gradually escalated her exploitation until she gained control over assets worth tens of thousands of dollars. The most shocking revelation came when Patricia tracked down Sarah's ex-husband David, who had been desperate to contact authorities about his ex-wife's criminal behavior, but had been prevented by legal restrictions related to their custody agreement. David provided documented evidence of Sarah's previous rental schemes using his own family's properties during their marriage. According to David, Sarah had operated vacation rental businesses using his parents' beach house and his brother's mountain cabin without the owner's knowledge or permission. She had forged documents, created fake rental agreements, and collected thousands of dollars in revenue before being discovered and forced to cease operations. David explained that Sarah's pattern involved identifying valuable properties owned by people who trusted her, then gradually escalating her access and control until she was operating full-scale rental businesses using other people's assets. Her skill at emotional manipulation and document forgery had allowed her to avoid criminal prosecution in previous cases, but the evidence was overwhelming once victims understood the scope of her deception. The most damning revelation was that Emma's supposed medical bills and Sarah's eviction notices were completely fabricated. David showed Patricia medical records, proving that Emma was perfectly healthy and had never required any of the expensive treatments that Sarah had claimed were draining her finances. Sarah's apartment lease was current and stable, with no eviction proceedings or financial difficulties that would justify her claims about needing rental income for survival. The entire sob story about medical expenses and housing insecurity had been carefully constructed to manipulate my sympathy and justify her increasingly aggressive exploitation of our property. Patricia discovered that Sarah had been working with Marcus Webb on multiple similar cases, suggesting that the attorney was complicit in her schemes, rather than simply representing a client who had been caught in property violations. Webb had a history of filing frivolous lawsuits and had been sanctioned by the state bar for ethical violations related to fraudulent claims. The evidence that Patricia assembled painted a picture of criminal activity that went far beyond simple property misuse. Sarah had been engaged in systematic fraud, forgery, and identity theft as part of a sophisticated operation designed to exploit trusting families and steal control of their valuable assets. Most importantly for my immediate situation, Patricia discovered that Sarah had been forging my signature on official documents, including a fraudulent lease agreement with Mountain Vista Property Management and a false insurance claim for damage she had allegedly caused to the cabin. These forgeries constituted multiple felonies that could result in significant prison time if prosecuted properly. The insurance fraud was particularly serious because Sarah had filed a claim for expensive repairs that were supposedly needed due to accidental damage during one of her stays. The insurance company had paid the claim without investigation, and Sarah had pocketed the money while leaving the supposed damage unrepaired. Patricia explained that the combination of forgery, fraud, and identity theft created a strong criminal case that would likely result in immediate arrest and prosecution if presented to the district attorney's office. The evidence was overwhelming and well documented, with multiple victims and a clear pattern of escalating criminal behavior. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope that justice might be possible and that Sarah's manipulation and exploitation could be stopped before she caused even more damage to our family and other potential victims. Patricia Coleman worked quickly to present our evidence to the district attorney's office, emphasizing the sophisticated nature of Sarah's criminal operation and the multiple victims who had been harmed by her schemes. The prosecutor assigned to review the case, Assistant District Attorney Maria Rodriguez, was experienced in white-collar crimes and immediately recognized the seriousness of the charges that could be filed against Sarah. The evidence package that Patricia assembled was comprehensive and overwhelming. Financial records from Mountain Vista Property Management showed the full scope of Sarah's rental operation, while the forged documents provided clear proof of identity theft and fraud. David's testimony about similar schemes in other states established a pattern of criminal behavior that made prosecution a priority for protecting future victims. Rodriguez agreed to file charges immediately, including multiple counts of fraud, forgery, identity theft, and insurance fraud. The criminal case was strong enough that Rodriguez felt confident about securing convictions on all major charges, which would result in significant prison time and mandatory restitution for all victims. Sarah's arrest happened during what she had planned as a celebratory family dinner, where she intended to announce the expansion of her cabin rental business and her plans to manage additional properties in the Lake Tahoe area. She had invited Jessica's parents and extended family members to witness what she portrayed as her successful transformation from desperate single mother to thriving entrepreneur. The timing of the arrest was particularly satisfying because it exposed Sarah's deception in front of the family members who had been supporting her and criticizing my attempts to protect our property. When police officers arrived with arrest warrants during the dinner, Sarah's carefully constructed facade collapsed completely. Jessica watched in shock as her sister was handcuffed and read her rights on charges that included multiple felonies punishable by years in prison. The reality of Sarah's criminal behavior became undeniable when the officers explained the evidence that had led to the arrest, including forged documents bearing my signature and fraudulent insurance claims totaling thousands of dollars. The forged documents and financial records that police had seized from Sarah's apartment painted a clear picture of systematic criminal activity that had been planned and executed over many months. Sarah's desperate claims of innocence and victimhood fell apart when confronted with evidence that showed calculated deception rather than misguided attempts to survive a crisis. David's cooperation with authorities and his testimony about Sarah's previous victims created an ironclad case that would have been impossible for even the most skilled defense attorney to overcome. Sarah's pattern of targeting families through personal relationships and exploiting their trust for financial gain was documented across multiple states and numerous victims. Marcus Webb abandoned Sarah's case immediately when faced with the criminal evidence and the possibility that his own involvement in her schemes might result in disbarment or criminal charges. Sarah was left with a public defender who advised her that fighting the charges would likely result in harsher penalties than accepting a plea bargain. Mountain Vista Property Management cooperated fully with authorities and provided complete financial records showing the money that Sarah had collected through fraudulent rental agreements. The company's willingness to testify against Sarah strengthened the prosecution's case and ensured that restitution would be calculated accurately. Emma was placed temporarily with Jessica's parents, while David petitioned for emergency custody, revealing that Sarah had been systematically denying him court-ordered visitation rights and using their daughter as a tool for emotional manipulation. The custody hearing exposed additional lies that Sarah had told about David's character and his relationship with Emma. Sarah ultimately accepted a plea bargain that included 2 years in prison, 5 years of probation, complete restitution to all victims, and mandatory counseling for the psychological issues that had driven her criminal behavior. The plea agreement also included a restraining order that prohibited Sarah from contacting me or Jessica or coming near our property. Jessica was devastated by the revelation that her sister was a career criminal who had been manipulating our entire family for months. The evidence presented during the legal proceedings forced Jessica to confront the reality that her loyalty to Sarah had blinded her to obvious signs of deception and criminal behavior that should have been impossible to ignore. Our marriage required extensive counseling to repair the trust that had been damaged by Jessica's ultimatum and her willingness to support Sarah over her own husband. Jessica struggled with guilt about how easily she had been manipulated and how close she had come to destroying our marriage to protect someone who was systematically exploiting our generosity. The marriage counseling process helped Jessica understand how Sarah had used family loyalty and emotional manipulation to turn her against me, and how her sister's apparent crisis had been carefully orchestrated to generate sympathy and support for criminal activities. Jessica learned to recognize the tactics that abusers and con artists use to isolate their victims from people who might protect them. Our family's August reunion proceeded as planned, with Jessica's parents offering heartfelt apologies for their initial reaction to the conflict. They acknowledged that they had been manipulated by Sarah's lies and emotional appeals, and they expressed gratitude that I had persisted in protecting our family's legacy despite the pressure to accommodate Sarah's demands. My grandparents were particularly moved by learning how close our family had come to losing the cabin that represented 3 generations of memories and traditions. They expressed pride in how I had fought to protect Walter's legacy, while still trying to help someone who appeared to be in genuine need. Frank Morrison became a close friend and trusted advisor who helped me install additional security measures to protect the cabin from future exploitation. His law enforcement experience and knowledge of property crimes proved invaluable in creating safeguards that would prevent similar schemes from succeeding in the future. Patricia Coleman became our family's permanent attorney, helping us create comprehensive legal protections for all of our properties and assets. She educated us about the warning signs of manipulation and exploitation, ensuring that our generosity toward family and friends would never again leave us vulnerable to criminal behavior. David successfully gained primary custody of Emma, who flourished in a stable environment free from the chaos and manipulation that had characterized her life with Sarah. Emma was able to maintain a healthy relationship with Jessica under supervised conditions that protected her from exposure to further criminal activities or manipulation. The most surprising outcome was Sarah's genuine transformation during her time in prison and mandatory counseling. The psychological treatment she received helped her understand the trauma and mental health issues that had driven her criminal behavior, and she eventually took full responsibility for the harm she had caused to our family and other victims. Sarah completed her sentence and moved to another state, where she built a legitimate life working in social services to help other women who had experienced domestic violence and financial instability. Her counseling experience had taught her healthy ways to address crisis situations without resorting to deception and exploitation of people who cared about her. Years later, Sarah sent a letter of apology that demonstrated genuine remorse for her actions and appreciation for the consequences that had forced her to confront her destructive patterns. She acknowledged that my insistence on accountability had ultimately saved her from a path that would have led to even more serious crimes and harsher punishments. The experience taught me profound lessons about the difference between enabling destructive behavior and providing genuine help to people in crisis. True family support requires boundaries and accountability, not blind loyalty that allows harmful behavior to continue and escalate without consequences. I learned that protecting what matters most sometimes means making difficult choices that initially appear harsh or unsympathetic, but ultimately serve everyone's best interests by preventing greater harm and encouraging genuine growth and healing. Generosity without boundaries becomes exploitation, and trust without verification becomes victimization. Our family's vacation cabin remains a sacred space where multiple generations gather each August to strengthen the bonds that hold us together across distance and time. The traditions that my grandfather established continue to provide meaning and connection for his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, who understand the value of protecting what previous generations built with love and sacrifice. The security measures and legal protections we implemented ensure that future acts of generosity toward family and friends will be grounded in wisdom rather than naive trust, and that our willingness to help others during genuine crises will never again leave us vulnerable to systematic exploitation by people who mistake kindness for weakness. Jessica and I emerged from this crisis with a stronger marriage built on hard-won wisdom about the importance of supporting each other even when family pressures create conflicting loyalties. We learned that protecting our relationship and our shared values sometimes requires standing together against people who would exploit family connections for personal gain. Most importantly, I discovered that standing up for what is right, even when it costs relationships and creates temporary conflict, ultimately protects everyone involved by preventing greater harm and encouraging genuine accountability that leads to real growth and positive change. Have you ever found yourself torn between helping a family member and protecting your own boundaries? How do you balance generosity with the need to prevent exploitation in your own relationships? I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story and for taking the time to understand the complex dynamics that can emerge when family loyalty conflicts with personal responsibility. Please like this video. If it resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about real-life challenges and the lessons they teach us, and share this with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of maintaining healthy boundaries, even with people we love. I wish you wisdom and strength in navigating your own family relationships and the difficult decisions they sometimes require.